Good evening. Thank you all for joining us. On behalf of New Debate, we're thrilled to have you here. For those of you who may not know, New Debate is a media company providing the antidote to the polarized media landscape of today. It's something that I'm super passionate about. I'm the VP of Communications for the company. All of the executives are here present. And tonight's going to be a really special night for us. It's our first public event, or rather, it's one of our first events. And we get to showcase some of our stellar content, as well as have the really incredible honor of having General Ben Hodges here to talk about the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. So today, you will hear not only that, but we will also have General Ben Hodges and our own CEO, Matt Dreyer, which we will be talking about shortly. It is really incredible to see how things can be manipulated via press and social media. So we truly want to be the source for facts-based content, whether it's short-form content, long-form content, any type of content that you can experience, audio, etc., featuring incredible advisors that we have on our board, as well as experts that we have in our community. And General Ben Hodges is one of those incredible advisors that we have on our board. And we're so thrilled to have him here tonight to talk about the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. He is on the news pretty much every day in this incredible news cycle that's changing constantly, a war that's happening on the ground as well as across media. So he, as an advisor, is an incredible resource for us to be able to explore the things that we may not be thinking of, the things that we, as a community, as an audience, may not be thinking of, to give us the opportunity to say, this is how, over time, in the past, we're looking at our past to really define the future, and we can change that, the communication and the way we share that information with the media. So it is my deepest honor to invite to the stage General Ben Hodges, who is an advisor for New Debate. And let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the privilege of your time. And now I know what it feels like to be interrogated. Those lights are really bright. I want to come down onto the floor if it's okay. By the way, the good-looking guy behind the camera, that was his voice that you just heard on the trailer, and he's a voice model. So I'm going to take about the next 15 minutes and give you my assessment of what's going on in Ukraine. My assessment of it. I don't have access. I'm retired from the Army now 4.5 years, so I don't have access to classified information. Most of what I know is based on 40 years of experience, having been in Ukraine quite a few times, helping train Ukrainian soldiers when I was still in the Army. But I've been retired for about 4.5 years. And so, I read like a college student now. I'm constantly studying, looking at multiple sources, online sources, dozens of different newspapers. And you could imagine I participate in all sorts of different groups, trying to stay on top of what's going on. And of course, part of the challenge is that the Kremlin doesn't want us to know what's going on. They have their own narrative about what this is all about. That this is about, it started off, it was NATO's fault. They had no choice but to attack Ukraine because NATO was encircling them. Of course, if you look at a map, about 6% of Russia's border touches NATO. So there was never an encirclement, but that was part of the narrative to try and divide all of us, because there were people in Europe that, and even here in the U.S. that believe, well, maybe NATO grew too fast, so maybe it is our fault. So that's part of the disinformation environment that's out there. And then they talked about it was their duty to go rescue their brother Slavs and to denazify the Ukrainian nation. So this was another reason, another justification for what they're doing. And then even President Putin calls it a special military operation. It's a crime in Russia to call it a war, because that would be difficult to explain to Ukrainians why they're doing, to Russians why they're doing what they're doing. So there is a lot of uncertainty and confusion and disinformation surrounding what's actually happening. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have done a masterful job. They have captured the narrative. Now, not surprisingly, there's some exaggeration on the number of Russian soldiers that have been killed and how many tanks have been destroyed and so on. So you still have to look at multiple sources to figure out what's really happening on the ground. For me, I trust British intelligence and Bellingcat. Bellingcats will only count a Russian tank as destroyed if they have video and geolocation data for that vehicle. So generally speaking, their numbers are best. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about numbers, because that can drag you down into details and you can lose track of the bigger picture. But it is useful to understand the impact of casualties and lost equipment, because I'm going to tell you, Ukraine is going to win. I mean, they're going to win. Not because I want them to, but because they are, for about 3 reasons. Number one, they have superior will. They're defending their country. Women and men there are defending. I mean, I've seen Ukrainian soldiers saying, "That's my village back there, and my grandparents, still live there." I mean, that's what they're defending. And I knew the Ukrainian soldiers would do well. What surprised me was been the resilience and the courage of Ukrainian people. I mean, women, old people, kids. I mean, they are committed. And you've all seen President Zelensky, who was not terribly popular, by the way, before the war started. He was having a lot of domestic challenges, but he has shown the impact of positive leadership. I remember seeing him on, I think it was day 3 after the Russian attack started on 24 February, and he was out there with a cell phone talking, and I thought, how cool. And the president of Ukraine is out there talking to the people, talking to the world, and I thought, how the hell is his cell phone still working? Why? I mean, the U.S., that would have been the first hour, all communications networks would have been wiped out. And so that was the first sort of indicator that the Russians were not that good, that they didn't have capabilities that I had always assumed that they had. And I certainly am guilty of having overestimated their capabilities. They're killing a lot of people. They're destroying a lot of stuff. This is not going to be easy. But we grossly overestimated them. And I think we actually still overestimate their ability to escalate. And it's causing us to make to not provide as much as we should, as fast as we should. And I'll come to that. But that's the first reason that I think Ukraine is going to win. They have the superior will. And we know that from the history of warfare, that war is a test of will. I mean, all of you know examples of where smaller armies, smaller nations were able to defeat a larger nation. Right here in the United States, our revolution, we were going against the best army and navy in the world. And yet, after over 8 years of defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat, George Washington keeping the army together, we managed to achieve independence. So that was about will, and the other side having lost the desire to achieve their strategic objective. Of course, it happened to us in Afghanistan. We lost there. We lost in Vietnam, where we were defeated by smaller, less technologically advanced forces because of will. So I have plenty of confidence in the ability of Ukraine to win. The other will, though, is at the higher level. The president of the Russian Federation, President Putin, he does not care how many of his soldiers are killed. He does not care what damage is done to their economy. He absolutely does not care. Does not care how many Ukrainian civilians are killed. That's not a calculation, except to do more to put pressure on all of us. At the same time, here in the United States, we have serious domestic challenges, and the Russians are putting money and action into that to exacerbating the divisions that we have in our own country that you just saw in the trailer. Germany, their economy is going to be pounded. I mean, seriously, this is not about room temperature, living in a slightly cooler room in wintertime because of gas getting turned off. The entire economy is going to get hit hard. And now you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people perhaps even being out of work. That's not inconsequential. UK having turnover in the prime minister's position in the whole government. Italy, prime minister just resigned. So the Russians see all that, and they're putting pressure on that. And I think that the Kremlin, I should say, are hoping things just get through till wintertime that we'll all quit. We'll be so distracted. It's so expensive. Why does it matter? Why are we doing this? That's what the Kremlin is counting on. So now it's a test of will, not at the soldier level. We already know who has the advantage there. On the Russian side, these are conscripts. There's not a Russian soldier that wants to be there. They're now being taken out of prison, put into Russian army units, or they're being sent into a conflict with 4 weeks of training. All right, this is they're scraping the bottom of the barrel from a manpower standpoint. But the test of will at the top, can our leaders stick together with Ukraine and deliver everything that's needed to help Ukraine win? Do we have more will than does the president of the Russian Federation? That's the most important test over the next few months. It's also a test of logistics, and this is the second reason why I believe that Ukraine is going to win. You look at the map, and we've been watching video now for the last 5 weeks, and you keep hearing this narrative. It's inevitable. The Russians are going to win. They have so many more people. They have a much more modern military. It's inevitable. That's a narrative that's out there. And a lot of people pick up on it because they're lazy thinkers. Well, look, I mean, of course, it's huge. I spoke to a very, very, very well-educated person just yesterday about the size of Russian forces, and I mentioned that, well, actually, Ukraine has as many troops as Russia does. He said, how can that be? Russia's huge. I said, well, the population of Russia is only about 135 million. He said, what? Most of us, as I look around the room, most everybody here is at or over 30 years old, and we all grew up, with the Soviet Union with 300 million people. The Russian Federation has about 140 million, probably even less than that. It's a very unhealthy population. Many of the younger people are getting the hell out of there while they can. And so you've got a manpower pool that's shrinking, unhealthy, doesn't want to fight. On the other hand, Ukraine has a country of 44 million people. The government immediately said all men under the age of 60 have to stay. You can't leave. And many of the millions of people who left as refugees have already come back. So you literally have millions of military age women and men in Ukraine ready to fight, to defend their country. So that's a significant manpower advantage for Ukraine. What they don't have, of course, is a large pool of trained soldiers. So now we're playing catch up. Ukraine started too late. We're playing catch up on that. But on the logistics side, and here, you can challenge me on this, though. What I don't know is how much artillery ammunition Russia still has. I mean, it seems like they have trillions of rounds. They're shooting almost 20,000 rounds a day. That's a lot of artillery ammunition. Now, they are not famous for having taken care of their ammunition. Some of you probably know that ammunition has a shelf life. It can go bad. It's not like a hammer. I mean, over time, an artillery round goes bad because the explosive in it goes bad. So you have to take care of it, store it properly, and you use the oldest ammunition first for training. I would assess that probably half of what they have is unserviceable, very dangerous. In fact, they still have a lot of ammunition, but not endless. I just don't know how much. Of course, because the success the Ukrainians have had here over the last few weeks now, since they started getting capability that can reach long distance with precision, and every day you can see a Russian ammunition storage site going up in smoke. I mean, it's almost literally every day. Or you get a report of a command post that was hit that's 25, 35 miles away. Pinpoint precision. Now the Russians are having to move their ammunition further back, and they depend on trains to bring it from Russia, and so it gets dumped off a train into a storage place, typically warehouses, so it's not properly stored where you can prevent if there's an explosion. Obviously you want to contain that. You don't want everything else blowing up. They're not doing that. So if you can get one round into the storage site, the whole thing is going to go up. So they've moved their storage sites back further from the line, which doubles the number of trucks they require now to have to bring the ammunition forward. So you see this ripple effect of destroying some of their logistical infrastructure makes it even more difficult for them. Most people are assessing now, the experts that watch it, their logistical system is exhausted. The head of MI6 said earlier this week they are running out of steam by August. I would assess that within the next 2 weeks, you're going to see a significant change on the ground with advantage to Ukraine because the Russians are running out of gas and they're running out of ammunition. And interestingly, and I know we have a sanctions expert in the room tonight, and I hope she'll correct me when I'm wrong, the sanctions are having significant positive effect. They take a long time, and the average Russian is not feeling it yet. But I'll tell you who is feeling it. All of the precision weapons, the missiles that are used to hit targets at long range, the Russians cannot replace those because they have to import certain components that are necessary for that precision. And of course, sanctions now, they're not able to import what's needed. So they cannot replace the precision munitions that they're expending. That's a good thing. So they're relying more and more on conventional old school artillery ammunition and old rockets that are not precise. They also are feeling it because they used to import high quality steel from the United States and a couple of other countries because they can't make it themselves, which should cause you to ask a question, how can Russia not make high quality steel? But they can. For artillery, this is a little bit tedious, but it's extremely important, so bear with me. The barrel, the tube on an artillery piece, right? After about 2,000 rounds, 2,000 times being fired, you have to replace that barrel. If you don't, metal fatigue, it begins to droop, all right? And then at some point it becomes extremely dangerous to the crew, to the operators. They are not able to make the quality tubes to replace the ones on their artillery. So this is not the thing that's going to change the war in the next 2 weeks, but it's sure going to make it very difficult for them over the next 2 to 3 months to do what has to be done to keep firing at the rate they're firing. So in other words, what they're doing is not sustainable. Now, most of you probably saw a report the other day that said Russia was going to get drones from Iran. All right. I thought, Russia has to get drones from Iran? Russia, a land with more than 5,000 nuclear weapons, cannot make their own drones? So that to me is another indicator of the weakness and the rot inside their logistics system and inside their defense industry. And by the way, I think a lot of people that traditionally have bought their weapons from Russia are watching. This has not been a good marketing event for the Russians over the last 5 months. They've got about a 20% failure rate on their precision weapons. I mean, 20%, I don't think the American taxpayer would be happy if you knew that American precision weapons were failing at a rate of of 20%, but that's where they are. There's one other part of the sanctions that I had not thought about until my wife, who's German American, is reading German media. Turns out that most of the factories in Russia are, like, if you go to a city, it'll have one or two factories there, and that's kind of how they're distributed around the country. I imagine this goes back to the time of Stalin. As sanctions begin to take effect and these factories begin to have to shut down, now you've got tens of thousands of average Russians that are going to start feeling it, feeling the impact of sanctions. You know, shutting down in McDonald's in Moscow, that's not exactly the sanction we're talking about. But when factories are shut down because of sanctions, then people start wondering what the heck is going on. And it will be impossible, I think, for the Kremlin to continue the false narrative about how they're winning in Ukraine, and explain how could they have already had 15 or 20,000 Russian soldiers killed in less than 5 months, which is more than they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. Plus, the general rule of thumb is 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 killed, wounded. So if 10,000 soldiers have been killed, then generally probably somewhere close to 25 or 30,000 have been wounded. UK and the US both agree that there's been about 20,000 Russian soldiers killed. So that means probably 55 to 60,000 wounded. That's 85,000, don't do math in public. That's 85,000 Russian soldiers that have been killed or wounded. You can't hide that. Now, almost all those casualties, though, have come from Russian soldiers that don't live in Moscow or don't live in St. Petersburg. They've been recruited, brought in from out in the hinterlands, if you will. So ethnic minorities actually are bearing the brunt of Russia's war. And of course, this is done to preserve public support so that the Russians in and around Moscow and St. Petersburg, who, by the way, believe almost entirely what's being put out by the Kremlin. So for me, almost as important as providing long-range artillery to the Ukrainians is providing long-range truthful information to Russian population. There's an information dynamic that has to be won, as well as a logistics component to it. The third reason, and then I will halt after this and look forward to questions at the end. I think we'll have an opportunity for some questions, and of course after this I will stick around as long as anybody has a question or correction to what we're talking about. This is about autocracy versus democracy. This is not just, Ukraine is not an island. Ukraine matters because of where it sits in the Black Sea, in Europe. It's not a perfect democracy, but they've only been a democracy for about 30 years. I mean, at the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine for the first time is a democracy. They elect their leaders. They have all the normal chaos that goes on in any democracy, but they've only been at it for 30 years, and they've already had 2 legitimate presidential elections. The Russians don't fear NATO on their border. What they fear is a Ukraine that's democratic, prosperous, where the talent of young people is unleashed, and they become very prosperous. And then the Russians are saying, "What the heck happened? Why is life so much better in Ukraine than it is for us? Just like it is in Poland or Estonia or Latvia and Lithuania. Why is it so much better there?" That's what the Russians fear. And so this is a test of how much we value our own democracy. Because if Russia is successful in Ukraine in crushing Ukrainian democracy, that's not it. I mean, that's not the end of it. Putin has told us what his plan is basically to get everything back the way it was in the good old days when you had the Soviet Union that controlled everything on its periphery. And that would include at least 3 NATO members: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So, I mean, they're on the menu. They're on the target list. So if he's successful in Ukraine, then that's next. And that means now you've got NATO countries being attacked by Russia. And we're going to be in a very, very bad, serious war. So defeating Russia in Ukraine is for our security. Plus, the Chinese are watching. I mean, the Chinese have got to be thinking, man, if the U.S. with all their allies together cannot stop Russia and Ukraine, I don't think they'll be too impressed by anything that we say about Taiwan or South China Sea. And then North Korea is thinking, okay, the U.S., they can't keep the allies together. Maybe we shouldn't be as worried. We can do what we want to do, and Iran, and so on and so on. So this is about democracy versus autocracy. Critical is what happens in the United States. Nobody expects the United States to be perfect. Our European allies have very high expectations of us, but they know we're never going to be perfect. But they have very high expectations. And when we don't live up to our own talking points, we talk about, patriot and greatest country ever, we're a democracy. But if we don't live up to our own talking points and actually strengthen and protect those pillars of a democracy, our election, our court system, a free media, if we don't protect those things, if we're not interested and get involved in it, then it makes it very difficult for us to be the leader of the free world, keep everybody together, support Ukraine, and defeat Russia. So this is an important part of this conflict. And it's why I decided to join the new debate team. It's why I work for Human Rights First as a senior advisor. After 40 years in the Army, I thought, I spent 40 years protecting human rights and protecting our democracy. Now I'm an old retired guy. They won't let me be in the Army anymore. So how can I stay in the fight and keep doing that? And that's what New Debate is about. It's about helping energize the debate that's necessary for a democracy to be vibrant and to continue to grow. Because you've all heard it said, freedom isn't free. It's true. It absolutely is not free. It can be taken away if we're not willing to do everything necessary to protect it. Somebody else is not going to do it for you. And that's what's at stake here. That's why I believe Ukraine is going to win. They got superior will. The logistics is getting better. And we are all about, it's a group of democracies that have unlimited talent of young people, unlimited industrial capability, versus an autocracy that suppresses its own people. That's why Ukraine is going to win. I look forward to your questions here at the end of this, and thanks for the privilege of some of your time.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible privilege to be able to work with producers of such really high quality content and asking questions that are really challenging the world at large, the media we consume, the news we hear, and the things that we believe. And at the forefront of that is our own CEO and recently retired Green Beret. Very proud to have him here in Los Angeles as a resident, from his former life in Hollywood to his work in the military and now back to Hollywood. So thank you, Matt Dreyer, for your service, and also so excited about this new frontier that you're taking on.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and I just want to say on behalf of New Debate, thank you again for joining us here this evening and spending a few hours with us. Maria, I was going to say, since we're running a bit over on time, why don't we just go straight to the Q&A?
I think that's fine.
And then, because the main event here is Ben,
Absolutely.
Everybody didn't come to hear me speak. So I wanted the audience to be able to have a chance to engage with Ben and ask questions. And if there happens to be a question for an old tired Green Beret that's also on the stage, I'm happy to answer them too.
Amazing. I agree. I did not want to cut that short because I thought it was incredible. Thank you so much. So we do have a runner with the microphone over here. Thank you for doing that. And we'd love to hear your questions over there. In the meantime, though, Matt, I will not let you get away. Please tell us about New Debate and why it was founded.
Sure. So the genesis of the New Debate idea came at the height of the Trump presidency. And My old friend, Cord Christensen, who's here, who's the chief creative officer of New Debate, he and I had been talking for years about starting a production company. And finally telling the stories that we had put on hold 20 years ago when I joined the Army after 9/11. But we realized at the height of the Trump era that we needed to do something different. The division and discord and polarization in our society had just grown too terrible that we couldn't stand by and not do something about it. And the answer to polarization is knowledge. And so we formed New Debate as a public benefit corporation to push back against illiberal forces that are undermining democracy, not only in the United States, but also across the West. And when I say the West is no longer a geographic entity. It is a cultural entity, and at its best, a moral accomplishment because of the liberal democracy that we've been able to build. That is under threat today in the 21st century, more so than at any other time in my lifetime. And so we believe that media companies have a duty and a responsibility to protect and defend democracy because autocracy, as Ben described, is on the rise. And media companies have a part to play. That's why we formed New Debate.
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know, if you would like to get more information, follow us at New Debate Inc. across social media platforms, and also go to newdebate.com. So with your question, please.
Hi, my name is Bernd Willand, Army guy. General Hodges, do you, under the Russian strategy of escalate to de-escalate, do you see a scenario of a battlefield nuke? And if so, what would the response be from the West?
Thanks, and thanks for your service. Of course, the Russians have thousands of nuclear weapons, and I take that very serious. They've been talking for years about, or they've been threatening for years that they would use a nuclear weapon against several European countries under certain circumstances. But my sense is that their nuclear weapons are really only effective, or most effective, if they don't actually use them. Because we are all so concerned that they might use a nuclear weapon, and they can see that we're reluctant to do things. I mean, the White House, which has done a great job, this administration with strong congressional support, has done a very good job helping Ukraine, but we still are half-stepping on doing certain things because of this fear that the Russians might use a nuclear weapon or they might escalate somehow. So that's why I think that Russians are actually unlikely to use a nuclear weapon. And it also doesn't really give them much of a battlefield advantage. I mean, what they're doing now, they destroying towns and cities and infrastructure. They are exhausted, not just logistically, but their formations are exhausted. So if they were to use a nuclear weapon, they don't have forces available that are ready to exploit whatever might be achieved by the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. So it just doesn't seem likely to me. And finally, I think it would be impossible for the U.S. and the U.K. especially to stay out, to not respond if they used a nuclear weapon. And I think that's the last thing the Russians want, is a direct conflict with the U.S. being involved or the U.K. being directly involved, boots on the ground, F-35s, these kinds of capabilities. Now, I would expect that the Pentagon, the Joint Staff, is drawn up a list of options for the president, based on certain scenarios. How would we respond? And it would include, obviously, an in-kind response. So something to match whatever it is that the Russians did, that we would employ a similar type nuclear weapon, perhaps. But I also think that's unlikely. I think the more likely response would be a non-nuclear response, but one that would be devastating kinetic effect on, say, the Black Sea Fleet or Russian land forces inside Ukraine. That's how I think it would play out. I don't believe that President Putin is suicidal. He's evil. He's terrible, but I don't think he's actually crazy either. And I think that the people around him at the other end of that long table, they're thinking that there will be life after him, or they hope that there will be life after him. And I'm not so sure that he would be enabled to use a nuclear weapon as well. And I sure hope I'm right on that.
General, knowing that, as you mentioned before, war is a contest of wills, and that Ukraine's will is really not in doubt. Frankly, also, Russia's will historically is rarely into question. But the West certainly seems that is Putin's current strategic calculation, that over time, not the months that the Western commentary often talks about, but over years, as we've seen in Syria prior to this particular conflict, that will wane, and that is his long-term play. Do you think there's something to that?
That's an excellent point. Part of the reason we're in the place we are now is because we failed to respond in a meaningful way after Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. And you still have Russian troops occupying 20% of Georgia 14 years after the signing of the so-called Sarkozy Agreement. I mean, they still have Russian troops illegally occupying 20% of Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and nobody does anything about it. We haven't done anything about it. So they were not held to account. And then after President Obama laid a red line down in Syria, said if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons, we're going to have to respond. The Assad regime, supported by the Russians, immediately jumped right over that red line, and we did nothing. The U.S., UK, Germany, France, we did nothing. And so by this time, I think the Kremlin's feeling pretty confident that they could go ahead and take the next step, which would be to invade or to get Crimea, which they were always concerned about because that's the home of the Black Sea Fleet, and it's kind of the key to the Black Sea. And so they invaded Ukraine in 2014, captured all of Crimea, and expanded their support for the so-called separatists, which are not separatists, but the so-called separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. And we did nothing. I mean, we really didn't do anything meaningful. There were sanctions in place, but they were not designed to be to do the damage necessary to change Kremlin behavior. And no sanction yet has changed Kremlin behavior, nor do I expect sanctions will change Kremlin behavior. So because of all of this, it seems to me that the Russians anticipate that we'll lose interest. I mean, we have become lazy, complacent. All of us, including the United States, we pulled out of Europe as fast as we could at the end of the Cold War. The peace dividend. I can still remember thinking like, oh, wow, this is fantastic. And we were naive that the Russians respect only strength, and where they find weakness or appeasement, they push right in. And this is not about Putin. This is who the Russians are. And so now we're paying the price for it. And I think President Putin is counting on us either losing interest or getting distracted or losing the will to continue to support Ukraine. And so what that means is if we don't crush them now, if Ukraine doesn't win now, then I guarantee you next year or the year after that, we're going to be dealing with this again. Because a long war is to the advantage of the Russians. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that we all lose interest or get distracted or run out of money or ammunition, and then they will have recovered and they'll be ready for the next phase. So I think that's exactly what they want is a long game, and we play into that if we don't support Ukraine to win versus just avoid losing.
Alberto Gonima, I am an international healthcare consultant. General, I would appreciate very much your view of the link between the European Union and NATO. Particularly, I have opportunity to work in Ukraine Moldova, Belarus, Georgia. And I had difficulty in understanding the late response of the European Union to Ukraine, to Moldova. Georgia has not been even considered yet. Is there any link or there is none?
Thanks, sir. I think one of the reasons that we have not responded as adequately and quickly as should have, whether it's NATO or the European Union, is because we haven't taken a strategic look at the Black Sea region. We talk about Ukraine or we talk about Turkey, but it's more on an individual nation basis versus a strategic look at the region. If we thought strategically about the Black Sea region, then we would see the enormous economic potential for the Black Sea as a east-west economic corridor between Eurasia and Europe, for example. I remember my first visit to Georgia. I had the chance to meet the president there. This was back in 2013. Kind of a tourist question. I said, Mr. President, what kind of country is Georgia? And I think he was waiting all day to get that question. He said, we are an East European country that is the portal between Europe and Eurasia. I completely changed how I thought about the Caucasus, that it was a link between Europe and Eurasia. And so if we were thinking strategically, then we would have been investing significantly in Georgian infrastructure, the ability to transport energy, gas from the Caspian Sea region, and also building a seaport there that's big enough to hold the biggest ships that come into the Black Sea, that would then make that a better route for cargo coming from China, for example, to Europe, much quicker than sailing it the various other routes that they have to go right now. So this conflict, first of all, a lot of people now know where Georgia is. They now know where Ukraine is on the map, Romania and Bulgaria. So there's a strategic awakening. The European Union, Dr. von der Leyen, she has done a lot of work here over the last several months to build up the will as well as the resources to help with the reconstruction of Ukraine that's going to be required after this. So there's a recognition of the strategic importance. It's late, but I see that getting better. Moldova is an important country because of where it sits between Romania, Ukraine, on the corner of the Black Sea, and of course there's that one sliver. I'm doing this on my air map, I'm sorry. The sliver of land called Transnistria, which you know, a breakaway part of Moldova where you've got about 2,000 Russian troops. And the Russians are only interested in continuing the division and the keep that area unsettled. Now I think there's a chance that the president there, President Sandu, she's an incredible woman, incredibly brave. There are people, if we are supporting them with a strategic view and economic investment, diplomatic support, we can push back on the Russian narrative. We can push back on the disinformation. We can push back on the malign influence that comes with corruption and the amount of money that they're willing to spend there. So what Matt said, this is about education and building strong, resilient democracies. That's how you resist the kind of influence that comes from the Kremlin. And I think the EU is really stepping up in a big way now.
Hey, General, thank you for coming out tonight and talking to us. I'd love to hear sort of the significance of Sweden and Finland joining NATO and sort of what that means from your perspective.
Thank you. This is fantastic news. You've got two countries that are both strong, democratic, resilient societies with long traditions of democratic society. They're resilient in terms of, fitness, education, infrastructure. These are two countries that are bringing real talent. They also are two countries that are small in population, but they have very good, capable militaries. Finland has a very small, well, first of all, the population of Finland is about 5 million, yet it's a very large country area-wise, and it has a border with Russia that's about over 800 miles long. So over the centuries of living where they live and having a small population, they've figured out they can't have a large standing military, so they have to have the best rapid mobilization in the world, which they do. They can have about 200,000 troops armed in the field within just a few days, which is remarkable, but that's because the whole society is prepared to do that. Sweden is has a very good mobilization system, but also, particularly in the Navy, good capabilities here as well, and they've got a very good defense industry. So in other words, what the alliance will get are two nations that have the same values that the alliance has. They bring real capability, and they're both are on the way up in terms of modernization. Finland is purchasing 64 F-35s, which is incredible. I mean, that will completely change the whole air and missile defense capability of the alliance in that part of Europe. And it's interesting that when you think about what President Putin set out as his objectives, why he was doing this, of course, his actions have actually increased now. It will have the effect of increasing the amount of NATO that touches his border because of Finland. But he also exposed the lie of their narrative about they were concerned about this because he's taken Russian troops that are up on the Finnish border and taking them to go to Ukraine because he knows there's never going to be an attack from Finland. The problem, of course, in all this, which is why I'm glad you asked the question, and it goes back to our Black Sea strategy, Turkey is causing a real problem here. It's annoying, but I think also President Erdogan, and I don't excuse any of his bad behavior, the problems that I think they're the second worst country on the planet in terms of media, but that map is never going to change. I mean, the geography is never going to change. I don't even want to think about NATO without Turkey in it because of where it sits on the Black Sea. But what we have not done very well, the U.S. as well as NATO, we have not taken into consideration Turkey's security interests. I remember meeting the chief of plans and policy on the Turkish general staff a few years ago, and I said, "Sir, how's it going?" He said, "Ben, I wake up in the morning, I've got Russia to the north, Iran, Iraq, Syria to the south, the Caucasus to the east, and the Balkans to the west. It's a hell of a neighborhood." And it's kind of like, well, no kidding. But I'd never thought about Turkey that way. Turkey is always in the bottom right-hand corner of a map, of any map of Europe. And so we kind of have them down there. And so because of that, I think we made bad decisions about giving weapons to YPG, which is a Kurdish terrorist organization that has killed Turks. And so Turkey sees this as a betrayal that their American ally would give weapons to a terrorist organization. Of course, the reason we did it was because the YPG was very effective killing ISIS. And so we made a tactical decision against an enemy that deserves to burn in hell, but is not an existential threat. That's ISIS at the risk, and we damaged a strategic relationship with a real NATO ally. So because of that, and because Sweden openly harbors or has an open, I guess harbors is the right word, PKK, which is another Kurdish terrorist organization, openly in Sweden, then President Erdogan has said, well, hold on a second. Now, eventually this will get done. There's no doubt in my mind it'll get done. Everything with Turkey is a negotiation. But he's reminding us that, and Secretary General Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said Turkey's security interests have to be taken into consideration. I believe this will get done in the next few months, not as fast as we would have liked. But I think this is where the United States leadership has to come into play. That Turkey and the United States have to have a more consistent, trusting relationship. Hold them accountable for what they do wrong, but it's in our interest that we get this fixed. last point on this, amazingly, 18 members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted against Sweden and Finland coming into NATO. I cannot, out of the 435, it was only 18 that voted against it. But I mean, you can look online and see who they are. 18 Republicans from different states, and I can't figure out why they would vote against bringing in 2 more allies that will be security contributors, not consumers.
I'll tell you that I've been very lucky. I was very lucky in my 20 years in the United States Army, and the kinds of leaders that took me under their wing and really supported me during those 20 years. Ben will be the first one to say that I was a average to mediocre Special Forces commander, but nevertheless, I hit the jackpot repeatedly in terms of the leaders under whose command I was able to serve. For example, my first boss in the Army was General Mark Milley, currently Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That was the first boss I had in the Army. When I applied to graduate school, midway through my career as a young major, Admiral McRaven wrote me letters of recommendation to every graduate school that I applied to. That doesn't happen to most people. But all that being said, despite this pure luck and chance of having so many great leaders, it is without question that General Ben Hodges is the finest flag officer that I ever had the honor to serve with. And so I'm very grateful that he took the time to join us here in Hollywood tonight. Thank you, Ben.
I actually wanted to say thanks to this American Legion post. I mean, what an incredible venue, and the kind of what the American Legion is all about. Veterans organizations, whether that people served for 2 years or 32 years, that shared experience and sacrifice by them and their families. So when I heard that this was going to be our venue for tonight, obviously I was excited. I had no idea what kind of a place this is, though. I mean, Hollywood, iconic location. You may want to do an inventory of all the cool memorabilia. There might be 1 or 2 helmets missing after the night's over here. Really a neat place. So thanks for the privilege of being able to be here.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to both for your incredible service, as well as your service into the future with the media, with New Debate. And please, again, join us all outside. We'd love to answer any questions you have. As well, find us online, again, newdebate.com and New Debate Inc. across all social media platforms. Thank you again so much. Have a great night.